for Court Innovation. And we are so glad to offer this program for you this afternoon about working with women who use force. If we can go to the next slide, Shaw. We're really grateful to have funding from the Office on Violence Against Women to run the Abusive Partner Accountability and Engagement Training and Technical Assistance Project, where we're able to work with jurisdictions across the country as they seek to enhance their responses to working with people who cause harm through intimate partner violence, including women who use force. So through this project, we're able to put on national webinars like this that highlight amazing subject matter experts, such as our faculty for today's presentation from across the country. And we're also able to assist with other local training or tailored training needs for your community, as well as technical assistance. So we'll provide contact information for you to reach out to us at the end of this presentation. We can go to the next slide. So I'm very excited to welcome our wonderful guests that we have with us this afternoon. So I'll just say your name briefly, and if you want to unmute and just say a quick hello, they're going to walk us through a really amazing presentation. We're so grateful to have them with us today. So first we have Doris O'Neal from the WYCA of Seattle. Do you want to say hello, Doris?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thanks, Doris. And then next we have Melissa Scaia from Global Rights for Women.
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you.
Thanks, Melissa. And finally, we have Dr. Carolyn West.
Hello, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Really a dynamic trio of speakers here. So we're really excited to have you all learn a little bit from them. Before we hop into the learning objectives, I just want to I have a few of my teammates here. I just want to allow them to introduce themselves as well. Rebecca, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Tomford-Hauser. I'm the Director of Community Accountability and Engagement for the Gender and Family Justice team at the Center for Court Innovation. Nice to be with you all today.
Thank you. And then we have Shaw as well, who's also going to run through some of our tech concerns with you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shahrazad Hamda. I'm the Program Associate in Gender Family Justice with the Center. And I'm just going to go over a few brief tech items for today. We do have closed captioning and available for today's presentation. So feel free, that option should be on the bottom right of your screen, where you can select whether or not you want to see it in a transcript or through subtitles. And then just if we could just keep ourselves muted for the presentation to eliminate any background noise, that would be great. Of course, you can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question, or feel free to put any questions in the chat box and the presenters will try and answer them as they go along, or they'll be answered towards the end of the presentation. And if you are experiencing any tech issues, feel free to message me or Brittany and we'll help troubleshoot with you. And that's it for me. I'll give it back to Brittany.
Thank you so much, Shaw. So we just wanted to briefly walk through a few learning objectives that we're going to cover today. So as a result of this webinar, you'll be able to identify the different types of intimate partner violence as it relates to women's use of force, understand the impact of criminalization on survivors, particularly Black women, and discuss two different approaches to working with criminalized survivors. So Survivors First program out in Seattle, which is run by Doris, and Turning Points for Domestic Violence, which Melissa will speak about. And finally, if we go to the next slide, we just wanted to provide some framing for our work on the Abusive Partner Accountability and Engagement Technical Assistance Project. So as I mentioned before, this is an OVW funded grant, and we've been able to work with experts and faculty members from across the country to develop a set of guiding principles for our work as technical assistance providers, but also as work for abusive partner intervention providers to consider when they're thinking about enhancing their own responses to working with abusive partners. So instead of coming up with best practices or calling them best practices, because we really know that each community has its own strengths and its own challenges, we came up with these guiding principles to assist communities. So you'll hear some of these themes throughout this presentation and in all of the presentations that we do actually, but some of the ones that you'll hear about today are about particularly centering survivor voices, thinking about reflecting and valuing culture and community, and of course, being responsive to the unique needs of individuals. And in this case, that's women who have used force. So on our next slide, we actually just want to ask a quick question of you. We know that we asked you to put in the chat where you're from, what you're interested in learning about, but we also just want to know what your experience level is in working with women who have used force. If you want to add that in there, just so we have a better sense to help guide our faculty members. So we'll give you about 20 people have participated so far. So we'll give another minute or so before we close the poll. All right, we're at about 75%. Can a few more folks answer the poll? All right, so it's closed now. So we have some folks are very experienced with the population, about 32%. Some have some experience, 35%, and some have very limited experience, about 30%. So hopefully that will be helpful to the presenters as we move through this. And whatever questions you have, feel free to drop them in the chat box, and we'll have a question and answer period towards the end. And if you have anything that comes up in the meantime, again, we'll try to address it as we go on. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa and Dr. West to move us through our first section. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. So we just wanted to start with a little bit of framing in terms of language and sort of the words that we use. We know that a lot of people use different words, but these are some of the words. Myself and Dr. West are going to share some of the language that we use to think about this issue in terms of women's use of force. So the first is coercive controlling violence and abuse. Some people call that batterings. There's lots of different words. It's the sort of violence that we see the most in our communities, and that's the sort of violence that seeks to really control the thoughts, actions, everything about, a victim. So that's a type of intimate partner violence. The second is resistive violence, and that's the violence that is in response to being coercively controlled. And that's primarily who we're talking about today. There are some women who use force, of course, who are using coercive controlling violence and abuse. A lot of work has been done on this to see, what are sort of the predominant sorts of types. There's been a number of studies. I've been a part of some of those. So a lot of what we see in terms of this is women who are using resistive violence. The third one is abuse unrelated to coercive control. And so what we mean by that, and actually if you could go to the next slide, it'll help better explain that. It's really violence that's off of this triangle. So the triangle sort of represents a relationship where an abuser is using coercive controlling violence and abuse is sort of the top down, the kind we're used to in our work, where the abuser is trying to use a lot of tactics to control a victim. So trying to control, everything about them that we sort of see in the power and control wheel and other graphics and that sort of response. Resistive, as I said, is in response to that. And what abuse unrelated to coercive control is off of that triangle. Now, a number of studies have been done to say how much of that is off the triangle. In communities I've looked at, it's been anywhere from 5 to 7%, but that most of it, which shows up in the system, and that would be any system, not just the criminal justice system, but the family system, the civil system, is mostly going to be one of these two. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about how to figure out who's who in terms of women, who's using coercive controlling violence and abuse, who's using resistive abuse, who's doing something else. And so that's in part we're going to, help you think about a little bit. And then the other piece is, besides, who are they, is what do we do, right? And because not all women are the same, not all force is the same, for a whole host of reasons. So it's just a little bit of an introduction to how we're sort of thinking about this broadly. Dr. West?
Thank you so much for that. And I really want us to encourage us to think more about this as bi-directional asymmetric violence. And I'll talk more about that later in my presentation, but it may seem on the outset that this is somehow like quote unquote mutual violence, where both partners are using violence and are equally as violent. But I think we need to really sort of see this as bi-directional, in that both people are using violence, but it's asymmetric in that, yes, a woman may shove or scratch her partner, but then oftentimes female identified people get the worst end of the abuse. And so it's not exactly an equal fight. It's asymmetric in that the person who really is not the primary perpetrator, who really is a victim, is going away with more extreme injury. So we need to put that in context and not just assume if she's using violence, then it's an equally mutually violent exchange, because that's really not the case. And I know that Melissa and Doris will talk more about that later as well.
Mhm. So the next slide. So these are just some overall questions when you're thinking about this. You know, is there an ongoing pattern of abuse? Is the violence intended to instill fear? Is the violence intended to dominate and control? Who did what to whom, when, how, and with what impact? I think the thing that sometimes often I find is, you know, I remember one time when I was running a shelter in Minnesota, and a police officer, I'll never forget this, he came and he said, you know, Melissa, I found the first woman batterer. I said, really? Tell me about it. And, you know, for him, it was because she had used a knife. She had used a weapon, had caused severe injury. So for him, it's automatically someone who is dominating and controlling. And that's often a big mistake that we make, is that when it's a severe level of violence, too often the system equates it with a woman who's trying to dominate. And that's just not the case. Our analysis cannot be about weapon, about injury, that it's much more, there's much more to look at than that, about intent, for example. So I just want to say we have to be careful in terms of when we look at this, because even the second question, is the violence intended to instill fear? Lots of people can be scared in a moment, but not scared for their life. And they may not be living out of being scared. So this is a real important distinction that we make. Next slide.
So in terms of reasons for violence, you know, yeah, I even hesitate to put it that way, because survivors may actually, they may use that violence to retaliate against a male partner for abuse that they've sustained, or retribution to get even with their partner for some actual or perceived misdeed, or expression of anger, or attempt to gain attention from an emotionally unavailable partner. That's what the previous research seems to suggest. But I think, again, when we look at the nuances and actually start to talk to survivors who are using violence, this is a little bit, it doesn't give us a full picture. So I want to step back from the research a little bit and actually talk more about what survivors are telling us from their stories, and listen more carefully to what they're saying about why they're using violence. And previous research is a little bit too simplistic. So let's move on to the next slide. So previous research has actually kind of suggested that there's this interpersonal dependency, and the survivors are very dependent on these relationships. But again, it's more complex than that, and oftentimes is about lack of access to resources. Psychologists have also looked at attachment style and have found in previous research that oftentimes these survivors have these kind of insecure attachments, and they use violence in this way because they just don't cope well in relationships. And this is how they kind of resolve conflict and trauma, usually coming from some history of abuse in their background. Some of these survivors tend to suppress anger. They use avoidance as a coping strategy, but they also report lots of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. So it appears on one hand that they're overly aggressive and they're doing all this, but again, the violence doesn't serve them well either. But as we go through the workshop, I want to spend time really talking, though, about how some of these characteristics of women who use force, again, it doesn't tell the full picture. So we'll talk more about that. So the term survivor defendants is maybe another way of looking at this, maybe a more nuanced, critical way of looking at this. So researchers have started to call these women abused aggressors rather than they're just using violence for no particular reason, because we need to understand that they also are survivors of abuse themselves, although they may be using aggression. So they may be fighting back, and sometimes fighting back with what appears to be even more violence than the perpetrator. But the violence doesn't serve them well. That's not what they would necessarily be choosing to do to resolve the violence that they're involved in. So I would encourage you to take a look at this document, Criminalizing Survival, and it's downloadable on the internet, that we have to understand that these women aren't criminals, they're actually criminalized. The forms of abuse that they're using has been criminalized, but they're really forms of survival when you have very other few resources to cope with the violence in your life. So talking more about, I really want to focus on African-American women as survivor defendants, since they're overrepresented among survivors who use violence, and why that tends to happen quite often. Thank you so much for dropping that into the chat. They oftentimes don't trust the legal system for justifiable reasons. Black women tend to fight back more and use resistance because they don't have other options oftentimes. Oftentimes they're facing perpetrators who are using pretty serious violence against them. And like I mentioned, they're abused aggressors. And for them, this is not like they're controlling their perpetrator, but it's really a conflict resolution strategy that they're using to keep themselves safe with limited options. And I know Ms. Doris is going to talk more about her Survivors First program and what she's seeing there. So I'll also let her address some of that in more detail, but let's go ahead and move on to the next slide.
I think
Melissa?
this is you, Melissa.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so part of what I was sort of looking at in terms of, I did some work. The National Clearinghouse on the Defense of Battered Women had asked me to look at and do some work with interviewing victims who had been arrested and convicted. In part, what we learned, which was very interesting, is that there's been a lot of study about the effect of arrest. There's not been a lot of study about the effect of conviction on survivors. So that's in part what we wanted to look at. The biggest thing that we saw, I would say for sure, is that we saw that a number of women after being convicted, not only were not in a better position, they were actually in a much more compromised position. In fact, most of the victims that I interviewed said that the sexual violence in particular that they experienced increased from the abuser because they were arrested and because they were convicted, because most of them ended up on probation, they couldn't get housing, there are a whole bunch, a host of factors. But I mean, the stories are ones that will, give you nightmares, just horrific sexual violence. And just to give an example, one woman said, the thing is that he started to ask me to do things sexually with him that I didn't want to do. And so if I resisted that notion, he would say, that's okay. I'll make sure, to put some weed, in your food. And then that day, I know you're going to go get tested, and then you'll just end up in jail and you won't know, because that's what I'll do if you don't do this. So that's the sort of things that abusers were doing as an example of the increase in coercive control and violence towards women. We also found that there was an increase of financial dependency on the abuser that created limited housing options. Most states, a lot of states have, give landlords an out if somebody has a conviction related to any sort of domestic assault at all. And so lots of women felt more dependent financially and for housing on their abusers. The other piece is that what we sort of say criminalized survivors, a lot of them said that during their process of the court, they were seen as a threat to the public. And most victims said, like, as Dr. West was saying, is that outside of this relationship, they were no threat to the public. It was the violence that was being perpetrated on them, and they were using back to their partner to create safety for themselves, that was where the issue was. And so a lot of criminalized survivors are just saying that this was really difficult for them to be seen this way after the conviction. The other thing that the impact of the of the arrest and survivor was really not one that was explained to them beforehand. So most survivors said, there's so many things that I didn't realize what happened to me because I pled guilty. And the other part of that is now I've interviewed a lot of women who've been arrested and convicted. Not one of them that I've ever interviewed took it to a jury trial. They all pled it out for a whole bunch of reasons, and a lot of them pled it out early in the process and weren't be giving the information by anyone, by an advocate, by their defense attorney, that all these things would affect them. Because the other part of this is in terms of their jobs, that there's a lot of jobs. I live in the state of Minnesota, where if you have this sort of conviction, which are a lot of helping positions, which are often occupied by women. So for example, a number of the women were called in Minnesota PCAs, right? Which is a sort of a healthcare assistant. They all lost their jobs, right? Because you couldn't have that conviction in Minnesota and have that job. So you can't, in Minnesota, for example, you can't work in a school, you can't work in a hospital, you can't do anything you can't even work in a church, actually. You can't have any sort of helping job if you have that sort of conviction. So the effect of conviction was great. The other thing is that a lot of women were being court ordered to programs that were designed for abusers who are using coercive control, that their experience of being a victim who was resisting was always not being addressed, and not just in the content of the group. That was one thing, but also in terms of the fees. One woman ended up having to spend 3 days in jail because she didn't pay her fees for her group. Another woman had a newborn, and that group didn't let the woman bring her child, so she didn't have childcare. So the other thing is that in terms of the groups, they weren't accounting for the needs of the women who were court ordered, that were very different than the needs of the men. That lots of programs were saying, okay, one program, men, women, and it's the same. And that's just not our experience in terms of helping women. And we'll provide you a link to this research, that I did in the full paper if you'd like to see it, but it is on the National Clearinghouse on the Defense of Better Women's website.
Okay, so thank you so much, Melissa. I like to talk about contextualizing Black women's use of force because this is a population, one, they're overrepresented, and they're oftentimes misunderstood, the violence that they end up appearing that they're perpetrating, but we'll see it's really violence that they're more experiencing than as perpetrators. And I thought more deeply about this topic doing this work for about 30 years now, when I was writing my last book, Violence in the Lives of Black Women, Battered, Black, and Blue. And you can find much of my research, it's all downloadable from my website, and I'll make sure that people have access to that before this webinar is over. But I think that we have to figure out, how do we articulate the many similarities among survivors? It's easy to say, well, to take this sort of colorblind approach that, well, survivors of domestic violence, violence is violence. We don't really need to think about diversity very much. It's all bad. And there is an element of truth to that. There are a lot of similarities among survivors, but then how do we talk about the differences without negating the important experiences that African-American women face, and then not reinforcing the very same stereotypes that we want to avoid? So I've spent the last couple of decades to try to unpack that nuance there. And that's what I want to talk to you about. So next slide. So survivor defendants are, as I mentioned before, are women who disproportionately or disproportionately represented among women who use force in their relationships. And we really kind of got a glimpse of that with Marissa Alexander. She has a TED Talk actually, where she talked about, I mean, she actually went to prison for using force against a very abusive partner. And she fired off a couple of warning shots. And really, there was extensive abuse against her. And she ended up going to prison for a very long time. As a result of that, she's out now. But it really, I think, made advocates really start to grapple with what does that look like? That this woman was really not a primary perpetrator, even though she was using violence. And she gives a very interesting TED Talk. I would encourage you to take a look at that, where she talked about what that experience was like. So next slide. So I turned my research to this actually in 2007. I've been writing about this topic for some years now, and it was precipitated by having a colleague who was a business owner and had never been in trouble before, but had used violence against an abusive partner, but he called the police first. And it really made me start to think about what's going on here, that Black women are being arrested at disproportionate rates after using violence to defend themselves, and really starting to unpack the whole notion of bidirectional asymmetric violence and how it is that Black women are disproportionately more likely to be in those circumstances. And I'll be happy to share this article with anyone who would like to have access to it. Next slide. So the research tells us that if you look at racial comparisons, that Black women consistently report higher rates of recurrent violence. So it happens once and then it happens again. They're more likely to report overall and severe physical aggression and sexual aggression, and more bidirectional violence when you compare them to white women and Latinas. But again, those statistics, when we just sort of throw them out there with no context, that's really problematic, because we're not seeing why that may be, or why it may appear that Black women are experiencing elevated rates of intimate partner violence in their lives. And so, as I said, my research is really about unpacking that and contextualizing that. Next slide. Okay. So again, I can't help re-emphasizing over and over again, it's not mutual violence, although it may seem to appear. When the Ray Rice incident happened, people thought, oh, well, she was just as equally as violent as he was, and why isn't she in trouble here? But that's not exactly what's happening. And if we look at the next slide. And so we'll talk some more about bidirectional violence here. But in order to contextualize violence in the lives of African-American women, what we really need to be doing is that we need to definitely be taking an intersectional approach. We need to be considering not only race, but other identities of all the people that we work with in whatever capacity. That you don't just have a race, you have a sexual orientation, you have a gender and a gender identity, you have a social class, maybe you're living with a particular disability, you may have an immigration status that can pose challenges for you. And so whatever population that we're dealing with, we have to really be mindful of that. Because oftentimes, I'm just using African-American women as an example here, oftentimes they're living at the intersection of multiple forms of discrimination and challenges, which make coping with the violence even more challenging and makes it much more difficult for them to be able to leave. And so as I expand my research, really trying to unpack what it means to live Marissa Alexander is the name of that TED Talk presenter. Okay. Shaw, next slide, please. So I would contend, in order to really understand this intersectionality, we have to consider history. And we have to start really putting, thinking about historical trauma in the context of the people that we're working with. And a quote that really is meaningful to me is that why we need to consider history is that history would become all that men did during the day, but nothing of what they did during the night. So all those pieces of history that we oftentimes don't talk about impact the survivors that we're working with in ways that we may not be familiar with or identify if we don't ask important questions. Next slide. So it's time for us really to examine historical trauma, and I understand why there may be a reluctance and a resistance to do that. And people had mixed feelings about the 1619 project, but I think that this was in the New York Times, but it really sort of pushed the country to say, we can't ignore 400 years of trauma and violence that has been done in this country and the impact, the long-term impact that has had. We can't say, well, that happened many years ago, and somehow we're not living with the consequences of that today, because we certainly are. And so historical trauma is important to consider. Next slide. So as I do my research and I unpack all of this and try to understand why Black women are disproportionately likely to be victim defendants, I realize that what we're missing and what we have been missing is that we have to stop talking about intimate partner violence as if it were just one thing, and not understanding that Black women and other marginalized women oftentimes experience their violence in the context of not only historical trauma, institutional violence, community violence, and structural violence. And I'll talk to you a little bit about each of these in turn in the next couple of slides. So next slide. So what exactly do I mean by historical trauma? That is that collective, spiritual, psychological, emotional, and cognitive distress that happens intergenerationally. And it comes from multiple experiences, maybe originating in slavery and continuing to racism and discrimination in the present day. And it's not only African Americans who've experienced this, but if you think about historical trauma with Native and Indigenous individuals, you think about it, I've spent some time studying the Holocaust, and with people of Jewish descent, and that trauma being passed down from what happened over hundreds of years of various Holocausts kind of targeting this population, and how it gets passed down intergenerationally and influences those families over time. So imagine if you work with clients who have a history of maybe substance abuse in their childhood, you can see that pattern that it impacts them individually. So just multiply that for an entire population. So we can't continue to sort of think, well, the past doesn't inform or shape the future ability to function. So historical trauma, many populations will experience this. And so we have to talk about the current intimate partner violence in the context of that. So next slide. So think about it this way. You get with any group, you get a mass trauma of a marginalized population. It could be segregation, it could be physical, psychological abuse, it could be economic destruction, it could be cultural displacement where they're moved from one place to the other. And that profoundly impacts the first generation. And then all of that is passed down through multiple generations. That trauma response can be physical, social, psychological. It's passed down to subsequent generations. It impacts their ability to parent. It impacts their ability, their mental and physical well-being. And all of that shapes their ability to have relationships in the future. So understanding that historical trauma is not just this one-time event, it's intergenerational and impacts future subsequent generations. Next slide. So maybe here's another way of thinking about this. If we think about the physical response, we think about first or primary generations that experience this trauma. It impacts their physical well-being, their genetic makeup. It impacts things why we see higher rates of diabetes and hypertension in future generations who experience trauma. It impacts their psychological response. You get post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety. It impacts things like substance abuse, unemployment, domestic violence, breakdowns of families. And all of that just has a cascading effect across generations. And so it's critical that we understand that the people that we're dealing with now who you're sitting across, they may have multiple generations of family members who struggled. And not to say that people aren't resilient, because they certainly are, but we have to put it in this kind of historical context. So next slide. So often understanding that the survivors that I see and work with and that I see with the research, they're oftentimes dealing with a web of interpersonal trauma. The domestic violence is just one thing in their lives. They may be struggling with child sexual abuse, sexual harassment in their communities or workplace, community violence, psychological abuse. So it's all of these things combined. So next slide. So just think about it as a web that entraps people. Also understanding that people are also, the survivors that I'm seeing and that many of us are seeing are also dealing with institutional violence. So the institutions that are set up that should be helpful sometimes are less than helpful. So institutional violence is that violence that's committed by the state or agents of the state that should be helpful. So it could be police officers or social workers or teachers. This was a case in Texas where this woman called the police multiple times, and actually they just had a really slow response. They knocked on the door and left, and it turned out that she had, she was on the call and they could hear her screaming for help. The police left after they knocked on the door and she didn't respond, and she had been murdered. And her family found her a couple of days later. So there were a lot of institutional breakdowns that really contributed to that. So institutions may be less than responsive. Next slide. If we look also at, I was working on an article recently, and I'll be happy to share that with people, that if you look at transgender, Black transgender women, that they had experienced violence from police officers within the educational system, within the prison system, within employment system, within public accommodations. So here you are experiencing intimate partner violence within your intimate relationship, and then within institutions that should help you. So we see that the most marginalized individuals are experiencing violence all over the place. So that's just going to make it more complex, which means they're going to be more likely to use violence in self-defense because they can't turn to these institutions that really should help them. Okay, next slide. Black women also deal with structural violence in the form, and what I mean by structural violence, things like poverty, homelessness, racial segregation, all of those things complicate the violence as well. And Melissa referred to this, and Doris may refer to this as well. We're seeing higher rates of things like homelessness among survivors because in some places you could actually be evicted for calling the police. So that's a type of both institutional and structural violence that makes it much more difficult for victims to escape the violence and to get to some kind of safety. Next slide. And they're also experiencing this in the context of community violence. So many of these survivors are living in communities where they're also experiencing high rates of violence and abuse. And again, then there's just no safe place that they can turn to. So just understanding that when we're working, particularly with African-American women, understanding that they're going to have oftentimes high rates of what it looks like bidirectional violence. They're going to be more likely to appear to be victim defendants, but the types of interpersonal violence that they're experiencing within their relationship, Black women are higher rates of non-fatal strangulation. So they're more likely to be strangled or choked by their partners. They're more likely to experience reproductive coercion. So they're more likely to be raped or to have a partner who won't allow them to use contraceptions, and they may find themselves pregnant when they don't want to be, and they're more at risk for domestic homicide. So they're experiencing much more severe violence oftentimes, which leads to them using more violence in self-defense. Okay, next slide. So I'll go through this quickly because I want to really hear from Doris and Melissa about this, because they'll talk more about how can we do assessments, but making sure that you're aware of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, suicide, substance abuse, understanding more about the context of intimate partner violence that Black women are experiencing, and making sure that we're using culturally responsive therapy techniques that take into account all the types of violence that they experience. Next slide. So I've been doing a lot around, oftentimes Black women are really reluctant to reach out for therapeutic services. So I've been trying to do more podcasts and just really trying to reach the general public about like why Black women are so resistant to get help. And again, it's that institutional and structural violence where they don't feel like help is readily available to them. Next slide. Part of that reason is because often these stereotypes about Black women is that they're either so strong, they don't need help or assistance, and that's not going to be available to them, and they should be able to handle this on their own, which means that they're going to be more likely to use violence because they don't think that they can turn to the legal system. So those stereotypes that they internalize and that service providers internalize about them, that can make that more difficult. Next slide. One common stereotype is that they're super aggressive and violent, and then when they use violence to self-defend and to prevent the violence, then those stereotypes get triggered and they say, see, this is who you really are. So we're not going to provide you services. We're just going to criminalize you and lock you up. And so unpacking that kind of angry Black woman stereotype is going to be crucial if we want to reach out and help the women that we want to help. Okay. And so also this kind of expectation that Black women should protect Black men. And if you go to this website, they actually had a press conference after Ray Rice assaulted his partner, and where she was almost apologizing for what happened. It was more this kind of pressure that she needed to protect him and his career. And so for a variety of historical reasons, Black women are sort of called to do that. And so that may make it very reluctant, their resistance to get help as well. Next slide. So also making sure that all Black women don't identify as African American. We're seeing more African immigrants, more Black women from the Caribbean. And so the violence may show up in different ways for them than it does for women who identify as African Americans. So understanding those distinctions is really critical too. And so if I finish up with this, we just need to do more culturally sensitive techniques, and other presenters will talk more about that, but it's got to be tailored to the population that you're working with. Oftentimes, African-American women will do a lot of storytelling. They'll use humor or satire, because if you don't laugh in some reasons, you'll just cry, or prayer or meditation or activism to change the system. So whatever culturally sensitive techniques they need in order to cope with the violence, that's what we have to just be really mindful of, that this one size fits all model that we oftentimes use just won't work as well for every population that we're working with. So I'll go ahead and stop there and let other people sort of jump on and talk about different models or different programs for dealing with women who use force. And I'll be available for any other questions.
I think, Shaw, we can just turn it to the next slide and Doris will lead us now.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. West and Melissa. That was very informative and really kind of set the tone of where I'm going next with this. And so listening and hearing from Melissa and Dr. West, we kind of understand some of the concepts around survivors who use force. And so I'm in Seattle, Washington. I've been in the DV field 25 plus years. And with the YWCA, our mission statement is empowering women and eliminating racism. And we center and focus on the African American women and children. So with our team, majority of my team are women of color, and we primarily serve women of color. We had our DV shelter. I managed that shelter for about 10 years. And before, as we were doing shelter work and working with the many survivors that came through our program, many of them was African-American women. And so as we work with them and support them with addressing their barriers and what are their goals, one of the barriers that I kept hearing come up was criminal history. Criminal history. I was arrested. I pled guilty. I, wanted to get out of jail. And I heard it quite a few times. Before coming to the Y, I worked in the King County Prosecutor Attorney's Office, and I was there for about 17 years. And 7 of those years, I worked as a victim's advocate in domestic violence misdemeanor court. And I got to see it from the criminal legal system, but now seeing it from the community side of it. And so exploring a little further with the survivors, it's like, so what made you get arrested? Oh, I'm sorry. What made you, what happened that you got arrested? And so they said, well, I fought back. I called the police. The police determined I was the primary aggressor and I got arrested. And so thinking about some of the stuff that Melissa and Dr. West have already said about the stereotype of African-American women, we found that they were being charged a lot more. They were being arrested a lot more. And so then we stepped back to looking at what happened. So she calls 911. She's being abused, first of all. She calls 911. Officers come out. Well, because she is not appearing as a victim, she may be waving her hand, she may be talking at the top of her voice, but that is the way that she expresses herself. So the officers, of course, most folks know about the mandate arrest law. They're looking for who is the primary aggressor in this situation. And because of the way that she is expressing herself, she is determined to be the primary aggressor. So then she's arrested. And I share a story of one survivor that we work with. Well, I'll get to that story. I always like to tell my story before I get to the facts. So I'll slow down on that. So she was arrested and she was taken to jail. And so hearing these stories over and over, it's like, Why is it that African American women are being arrested more than any other race? Why is it that they are being convicted? Those questions were the why. Why is this happening? So in talking with survivors, and I speak primarily from stories that I have heard over the many years or the many survivors that I have worked with. And she said, well, I'll never call the police again. They came out, they were mean to me. They put me down. They said, oh, we can see why you're getting your ass whooped, and this is what she's saying police officers have said to her. And they arrest her in front of her children. They drag her out of her house. And one thing that I heard is another Seattle police officer who works for a program of women who are incarcerated. And she said, once the cuffs goes on, life is never the same. Okay, so you can go on to the next slide. So when the women are arrested for domestic violence, they go to jail. And because a lot of women have never been to jail. And so it's an ordeal, it's traumatizing, right? And so if she goes to jail and she's still acting a certain type of way, although she's expressing herself, but this is how they conceive as she's being angry, she's being violent, she's being uncooperative. And so she may be placed in a soft room. In one story that I'm going to tell you in a little bit, she was placed in a soft room and she was stripped down of her clothes, and they made her sit in that room butt naked for a whole night because she continued to cry and express herself. So now you're in jail, misdemeanor crime. Most of the time, when I was in DD court, the judge would set the bail anywhere up to $5,000. Well, that's not easy to come by when you're locked up, for one. And two, we're talking about our women of color that may be coming from, poverty and marginalized community. And so the bail itself is a barrier because she can't pay that. So she's going to end up staying in jail. So then you have an arraignment and you have a pre-trial hearing. Those are 2 weeks apart. And so in most courts, I'm speaking for the court that I work at, I don't know what they are in other parts of the cities and states. So she would end up, if she didn't do the next thing, she would end up staying in jail for that period of time. So while she's in jail, she's going to lose her job, right? She could possibly lose her housing. Depending on the situation, law enforcement may have contacted Child Protective Services and have taken her children. Then when she gets out, the abuse may start all over again. So now she gets out of jail. Okay, she gets out of jail and she can't go back to her home. And so because there's a no contact order. So now she's homeless. Now she's pled guilty on this. And so now she has a criminal record, which make her ineligible for some type of housing. Now she has to deal with CPS and then the post-traumatic stress. Okay, you can go on to that. So with all of that being said, was like, how can we address survivors' unmet need? And in partnership with our King County Prosecutor Attorney's Office, we were able to have some really deep conversation about the many women of color that have been arrested and were they really abusers. And so what the prosecutor determined and took a second look and a second glance at is to really look at these cases, these referrals that are coming in from law enforcement, to really take a second look at them. Has there been prior police reports? Has she filed for a protection order before? Has there been some type of third party reporting that in those cases she was a victim? And in the case that now she is a defendant, is she really a defendant? So the prosecutor's office has partnered with the YWCA, and in return, they take a second look at these cases and they are dismissing the cases or they are declining the cases. So far in a year and a half, we've had 140, might be more, cases. And what happened, they dismissed the case, they let the survivor know that the case is being dismissed, they refer them to us at the YWCA. So we have an advocate, we reach out to the survivor, and primarily we're getting referrals for African American women and women of color. So we have people in the seat that look like them. We dial them up opposed to waiting for them to call us, because they've been put on notice that their case is dismissed and that they're being referred. Is voluntary services. We reach out to them, we connect with them. So some of the stories, I know I got a little bit of time here, but the one young lady that we were working with, she had actually been charged with a felony. She kicked in the door where her abuser was with the children. And he called the police and gave the police the keys, and they entered her apartment and told her that she was under arrest. She asked that they not arrest her in front of her children. So they did give her that much, of not to arrest her in front of her children. They took her outside, but they left her children. She had to call a neighbor as she was walking out to have somebody go get her children. She is the individual. They took her to jail. She was so upset. She was expressing herself. They put her in the soft room. She sat in the soft room all night, butt naked. And just how demeaning is that, you know? And so then she gets out. She can't go back. So with the support, we got the referral. We reached out to her because, again, there's a no contact order. This was before the case was dismissed. So there's a no contact order, so she can't go back to the home. So we placed her in an emergency hotel. From there, we continued to work with her. We brought her into one of our transitional housing programs, and she is now striving. The kids are looking so much happier. She says the first time in over, many, many years that I have felt safe. This was the first time that I've had somebody say they care about me and be sincere about it. She will be moving on to permanent housing here pretty soon. She was able to get a Section 8 voucher. She attends our support group. She is talking about going back to school. She is, interested in getting counseling. And those are just one of the many stories of the survivors that we have worked with, just being able, and in our city, sometimes the DV program will not work with a defendant, victim defendant. And so we do. And when we talk about meeting that unmet need, to be able to provide those services, because a lot of times what we find with African American women, they don't know about DV services or gender-based violence services. And they're, that's important because then they can realize what their options are. They know that they have choices. They can become financially stable and, housing stable, where before they were dependent upon their abuser for all of those things. And so we're looking forward to continuing to work with the many women that we have been working with. We're also looking at, trying to have a diversion type program where for those survivors that absolutely have to be charged, that there's services, just as there is mental health court, drug court, battery treatment. We want to have some type of diversion. So if they are actually charged, they can get supportive services, get DV education, and then from there, their cases can be dismissed. So I may be up on my time. And one other thing that I wanted to add is we're also looking at, trying to support survivors that have been convicted to getting their records expunged. So that's my bigger vision of where we're headed with this. But so far, this was one of a kind. And we're quite pleased that the prosecutor's office, was able to acknowledge and do something about it as far as, the police reform and criminal justice reform. So that is my piece for now. I'll put my name and email in chat. If anybody has any questions or ideas, I'm more than happy to talk with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Doris. So this is Melissa. And so this is actually a great segue to talk about what I'm going to talk about next. So yeah, next slide, just keep going until you see the turning points one. Yep, there you go. Okay, so yeah, that one. So it's a great segue, Doris, because part of what our program is that diversion, right? In terms of what you were talking about. So, you know, it just supports so much of what Dr. West and Doris said, because in part, I mean, part of what we looked at is why are so many women ending up in abusive partner intervention programs. Now, CCI calls them APIP and other people call them DVIP, and I don't know, there's all these acronyms for them. But so I guess I just wanted to start with this. So just to say, you know, once again, I'm Melissa. So Turning Points was created by myself, Laura Connolly, and the late Ellen Pence. Ellen started the Duluth program. And Laura and I had been doing women's groups for women who were arrested. And we were kind of just like making it up a little bit because there was nothing out there. And so we kept telling Ellen this, you know, we live outside of Duluth, but we knew Ellen, we were good friends with her. And she said, no. We said, Ellen, people are using the men's group curriculum, right? No, they're not. Why would they do that? We just said, I promise they are, because there isn't another option. And so we met our friend Lisa Lawrence and talked with her, and you know, she had written something. So we're really good friends with Lisa now in Michigan. So one day in Duluth, and I then became the director in Duluth after working with Laura, and a phone call came in, and I happened to pick it up, and this man was on the phone, and he said, so we're starting a women's group for women who are arrested, and we're going to use your men's curriculum, and we're wondering what to do with that session on male privilege with women. And Ellen happened to be in the office, and I said, you know, actually, I think Ellen happens to be here. I think Ellen should take this call. And so Ellen did, and Ellen always joked that good thing that call wasn't in person. She said, because she rolled her eyes so much. But I just said, like, listen, Ellen, here's the thing. There's not a lot of work. I mean, the fact that Doris's program is right, a national one, innovative, and now we're in 2021, you know, we started Turning Points in 2012, and we're one of the only now, that's 9 years ago. So part of it, and what I love about CCI doing this webinar is that we have to start to think about that not all domestic violence cases are the same, right? There's a major lack of accountability in police agencies, and there are lots of poor arrest decisions. My office is in Minneapolis. I've seen that for sure. There's lots of problematic convictions, as Doris said, that happens. But also I know there's a lot of advocates on here and a lot of community-based advocates and shelter advocates. The other thing is that unlike Doris's program, there's a lot of advocacy programs who haven't prioritized this. I've even talked to some agencies who say, nope, if they're charged with a crime, we can't help them because we get VOCA money, right? Now, Doris uses VOCA money, right? That's a whole nother conversation I think people should talk to her about, right? Because that's what I've heard actually as the reason why people don't do it. They say our VOCA money doesn't allow it. But there really has been weak advocacy for victims who've been arrested. And the other thing I want to say is that, you know, Doris was talking about working with the prosecutors. The other group of people that we need to work with is defense attorneys. You know, sometimes as advocates, we think about them in a very particular way. I've really spent a lot of time with defense attorneys in the last year, and they, you know, they feel really passionate about this in particular because they've seen it. So I really encourage you to really find those defense attorneys in your community to be a part of that. The other piece that I just want to mention is about this being part of a coordinated community response, because what we don't want you to do is just take like our curriculum and start a group, right? We think about this systemically. And part of what we sort of say that Ellen said at one point, she said, if somebody ever asked, you know, what's the thing that's going to end violence against women? It's never going to be because men sat their butts in chairs in a group or because women did, right? That's not going to be the thing that ends it, right? So it doesn't mean that you don't do the groups, but our job is not just the groups, right? And the advocacy, it's systemic, right? Like Doris, I think, or as Dr. West said, that, you know, part of, you know, sometimes what women want to do is be activists. Be activist with women who want to go to the Capitol, who want to whatever they want to do. to seek justice for other women, right? So I just want to say that we have to look beyond this sort of like client focused, sort of approach and more of a social approach. So if you can go to the next slide, and Brittany's gonna put up something in here that Mary Asmus wrote. So I really encourage you to take a look at this. Mary Asmus wrote this piece called Got Justice. And Mary Asmus, one of my favorite people in the world, and she wrote this policy. She wrote one of the first policies in the US about how to write a policy for a prosecutor's office, a probation office, advocacy, and a CCR to address this crime differently, right? When women are arrested, because part of it is some victims do commit illegal acts, right? Some of them commit legal acts. There's both. The problem is that for the women who do commit illegal acts, they're getting treated the same, if not worse, than the abusers who are ruining their lives. So what Mary worked really hard to do is she worked really hard to create this policy called the Crossroads Policy. And so I just have to say, Brittany just put it in the chat. And the one thing about this piece I want to tell you is at the end of it is the sample policy, and it is a diversion program. I just want you to know, though, that I've been in a lot of CCR meetings. I want you to know that the product that's created here, there was a lot of screaming, yelling, crying, walking out of 3 years of meetings, and then another 3-year grant. They were both VAWA special project grants. So 6 years it took us to get that policy, right? That's a long time. And part of it, I have to tell you, is the prosecutors really were resistant. They were saying, if I have a woman coming to court saying, I just want to plead guilty, you're telling me to say no to that, not let her do that? We're saying yes. That's what we're telling you, right? Is to say no to that. So the one big thing too we argued about a lot is whether or not they had to have a guilty, do a guilty plea on the record. There was a lot of fighting about that. We ended up convincing them. Lots of communities do this policy and still require women. That was really important to us. So I encourage you just to take a look at that a little bit more. So how Turning Points falls in, which is the next slide, is the curriculum. Because we had to say then, okay, if we're going to be part of this diversion program, we need to create something that's different, right? We're not going to use something that's already out there. So we did a lot of interviews with women, focus groups. So Brittany's going to put in the chat the preview of the curriculum so you can see it. But a big part of it is a lot of women's stories. So the curriculum has more content than you would ever need, because part of it is we figure out with women the first 9 sessions, are they using coercive controlling, resistive, or non-coercive controlling? Because in part, you don't know, right? A lot of women come in and just say, I'm just as violent as him, right? And so we just accept them when they say that, but after 9 weeks, there's not always a lot of realization about what also is happening to them. The other thing is that we allow babies to come into the space. We help with transportation, right? We allow women, if they want to be activists. One of the things we did one time was they wanted to write letters to women in prison. We said, all right, let's do that, right? We're going to spend this week's session writing letters to prison, right? Now, women were required, but they wanted to do that, right, as part of their work. So the other thing I would say is that the Crossroads policy is gender neutral. So for the diversion, we haven't had any men to date qualify, and the policy has been in place for over 15 years. So I know we're going to go to the questions, so I don't want to say a whole lot more. There's one more slide, I think, right? Yeah, I think there's one more. Yeah. The other thing is that, a big part of this, and Brittany's going to share the assessment also. We spend a lot of time with women to understand. A big part of that 9 weeks is a self-assessment of, what's going on in your relationship. So we do that at the beginning of the first session and the last 9 session after that. But we really encourage you to connect with defense attorneys, get to know them. One of the things in the curriculum we encourage is have a defense attorney come in. There's a whole session on how you can do that. And I have to tell you, that's honestly one of my favorite sessions, because I think it's our responsibility to teach women what their rights are, right? Like, first of all, you don't have to talk to the police if you don't want to. You can, for example. But also what the law is, we had a woman, a defense attorney come in who's my friend. And essentially what happened was one of the women in group said, are you telling me that if I saw him cheating on me, that I can't go home, take all of his clothes, throw them on the front lawn and start them on fire? And I could get arrested for that? Because it feels so just considering what she's experienced. And this woman was being really honest, right? So part of our job is to help women understand what the current law is. And because there's lots of questions that happen. But anyway, we spent a lot of time, the whole purpose of the curriculum is helping women understand the violence they experience and the violence they use. And Brittany put lots of things in the chat. So questions?
Yes, we added all of the documents that Melissa and Dr. West and Doris were mentioning throughout, including the websites for both Turning Points and Survivors First. But now we have about 15 minutes left to answer any questions that you may have. So feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself to ask a question, feel free to do that as well. I did see one question earlier, Melissa, and I think it was when you were talking about, you had those 4 questions when you were talking about the context. And I think I'm trying to scroll to find the answer, but someone had asked a question about the primary aggressor assessment. So if you want to speak to that at all, it was on that slide where we had the 4 contextual questions, if you want to add anything about that.
Yeah, I mean, part of it, yeah. So that, that really is for us, we sort of say predominant aggressor. And the only reason why, that language was changed to predominant as opposed to primary was because a lot of officers, for example, were thinking primary meant who hit first. And so we really changed that language to predominant. I mean, it essentially is that we're always sort of saying, who's using violence for what purpose, what harm, and all those things. We're always looking at, is it top down trying to control everything she thinks, right? Versus resisting that for a whole bunch of reasons. The other thing I just want to say, which relates to what Dr. West said, I have to tell you, having done this group now for, since 2007, is that the women who come into this group, disproportionately women of color have always been, to your point. And also the level of sexual violence they've experienced in their entire life is often very, very high. So I just want to say that in terms of working with women in this group process. And we also get asked, can men co-facilitate this group? I want to say about that is, if you're a special man, now who's a special man, right? And part of it is you have to be a man who understands the space you take up, right? Because when you have so many women who experience sexual violence, if you don't have enough awareness of that, you should not be in that space. And having done men's groups, I still do men's groups every week. There are men's facilities who are good at it and those who aren't, who think they can just go into a space with women. And so, yeah, that relates also.
Thanks, Melissa. Anyone else have any other questions? I know we're just looking at the folks who joined the call earlier. Some folks were starting some of these programs. So this is the time to ask 3 experts any of your questions about engaging with women who have used force.
Hi, I have a question. My name is Jordan, and I do lead a group actually for women who have been court ordered and have been identified as being the survivor. I have a question in kind of addressing them. I'm constantly trying to make sure that they know that this group is not meant to be blaming and shaming, that they potentially had to use force to protect themselves, to survive, and that the group is not meant to say they should not have chosen force. Do any of you have suggestions on kind of how to go deeper in that to really, I guess, continue to talk about maybe alternatives to force, if that's an option, while also continuing to make it clear that there is no, to not shame them and to not say that, hey, you shouldn't have done this. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
No, it makes total sense. And this is a really important topic. So I'm so thankful you brought it up. because the thing is that what we don't want to do, right, is sort of shame or moralize, like, oh, I can't believe you did that, right? You could have done this. So part of what we spend time doing is help women understanding, right, what they're living under, right, in terms of the violence and the fear, so that they themselves don't moralize it, right? Like in self-shame, right, feeling bad about themselves. So that's a big part of our work, is to help them understand what's happening to them and how it affects them will help that. And at the same time, also I want to say, like, a word that we don't use, you know, in turning points in our work is we don't say, well, what kind of choice could you have made instead, right? That we really get away from that. And so many practitioners do that, say, well, you know, instead of, you know, putting up the baseball bat, what could you have done instead? We don't dissect incidents in that sort of way, that we stay away from that and look at the bigger sort of things that are happening in their lives.
Mhm.
I'd like to add to that too. Thank you, Melissa. When having those conversations with survivors that have been charged or arrested, it's also kind of going back to what Dr. West said, is understanding some of the history
Right.
of what they have grown up with,
Mhm.
what grandma may have did, you know, mom, or whoever that they've been, you know, around that may have been a survivor of gender-based violence.
Mhm.
And as we are working, like I said, primarily with African-American women, we're really talking about historical trauma even more so with the women that we serve, because like you said, you don't want to blame and all that, but we have to understand. And I think when people understand the concept of intimate partner violence, because a lot of times for women of color, they don't even identify with the term of domestic violence.
Mhm.
And so then you have to kind of break it down a little bit more of, is this person verbally abusive? Has he, you know, put you down, called you name, you know, took your medication, all the different type of abuses. And so what I have found with working with the many women is that when they understand that it's not their fault, when they understand what has happened to them that they did not cause, even thinking about with strangulation cases,
Mhm.
especially with women of color, where your skin is a little darker. And so if someone is strangling them and they're trying to pull that hand off of their neck, they're most likely going to scratch that person. But she was protecting herself. And so I think with a lot of the women that we're working with, they need to understand the type of abuses that they have experienced and understand that there is healthy relationship. Because what I find too is we know what abusive relationships are, but we don't have a lot of conversations about healthy relationship. And so that is another big piece. Also supporting them with seeking counseling. And we have to know seeking counseling does not make you crazy, right? It might prevent you from being crazy. And so with that stereotype around it, it's like, it's okay to go in and have a conversation with someone who is professionally trained to deal with the many traumas and situations that you have been dealt. And so all of that, if you're having a group for women who have been charged, it's really like, how do we keep you from not coming back here? And that's what Survivors First is to me. It's like, what do we need to do to support you, get you the tools and the information so that you're not back in the same situation again?
Right. I'd like to address a really good question in the chat. Jill, I don't know if you want to ask the question, Jill, I can read it, but what do you do with women who are using coercive control in the current relationship because they don't want to be controlled anymore, but they have a whole history of living under coercive control with a previous partner? And so maybe that's more resistant violence rather than she's using this violence to control their abusive partner. It's my kind of perspective on that.
I think in the same way, Dr. West, part of it is that what we found is sometimes women don't know any other relationship besides abusive, right?
Exactly.
So I mean, I remember a time Laura and I were facilitating group and we could hear the women whispering about us before a group. And we said, what are you talking about? And they said, well, we have this idea for group next week. And we said, what's that? They said, we want you to bring your husbands to group because we feel like we want show and tell that they're either gay or they are a rug that you walk on. And we said, well, what do you mean by this? They said, well, the only nice men we know that you refer to are gay, or we think that you're abusive and we want to hear if you are. And the fascinating thing about that is that they really saw relationships as either you're in control or being controlled, right? So, and because they saw us as strong women, they thought, well, we must be very controlling to our husbands. So it's really this notion that they don't have a model, right, for a non-abusive relationship. And that's where the conversation went. So that's in part how I'd respond to that, Jill.
Thanks, both of you. I think we have maybe time for one more question here, and Maya added this. So thank you, Maya, for this question. Do you have criteria for finding women appropriate or not appropriate for the program, and how do you determine that?
Yeah, I mean, Jill, that's why we, Maya, that's why we do really the first 9 sessions to help figure it out. We've just kind of, you know, felt like that. I mean, there's some that are pretty clear, but there's a whole lot that aren't, you know, appropriate. And so we've always said, we're going to do these 9 sessions with women, do an assessment before and after. And we may say, you know, this woman should not be here. And we've certainly done that before. With some women. There, you know, there's also a big question about what about women in lesbian relationships, right? And so part of what I always say is Turning Points was created through focus groups and interviews with women in intimate partner heterosexual relationships. And that's my experience. You know, if there is someone who wrote a curriculum, you know, for lesbian relationships, I know some people are doing some work, you know, we'd love to know about that. Some people have, you know, used our curriculum, and we've had women who have used violence in lesbian relationships in our groups. But I just want to make sure that people understand it wasn't created with that population of women.
And for the program, the Survivors First program, you know, we're getting the referral from the prosecutor's office. But sometimes, you know, if there's severe substance abuse, severe mental health issues, we may have to work around that. And even for some who have a very extensive criminal history, you know, they may not be, we want people to do the program because they want to do it, because it is voluntary services. And so, you know, we do assessment, but if they want to participate in services, kind of like what Melissa said, is assessing, you know, to see where they fit in, where they want to fit in, or where they want to be with, okay, I don't want to go through this again, so I want to utilize all the services you have. And then we have found a lot of our women are very much, even though the case is dismissed, they don't have to, they do want to engage. So we try not to, you know, say not a good fit or a good fit, but it's like looking at centering them, putting them in the center of the room and like, what is it that they need?
Thank you, Doris. I think we are coming up on just a few minutes left, so I want to go to the next slide, which just has everyone's contact information. I know this was also dropped in the chat, but we also just wanted you to know that this is going to be available to you on the slides that we'll send out afterwards. So you'll see all of their email addresses and all of their website information, as well as the specific website for domestic violence Turning Points. So feel free to reach out with any other questions. You can also reach out to our office as well as the technical assistance and training provider for the Office on Violence Against Women for working with abusive partners. So I'm going to drop that email address in the chat as well. So you can definitely feel free to reach out to us for any training or technical assistance concerns. We will be sending out this slide deck as well as all of the different resources. There were so many wonderful resources that Doris, Melissa, and Dr. West shared. So we'll send out a document or an email afterwards with all of that information. And the last thing that I wanted to say is that we do have an evaluation that we would love for you to fill out. It helps us to improve our programming for our grant program. So please fill that out. And Shah has just put that into the chat, so I'm going to add it as well. So take a minute, shouldn't take too long to fill that out. And we'll also include it in the information in the email that we send out within the next week or so. And I just want to end giving a huge thanks to Doris, Melissa, and Dr. West for their fabulous presentations, really just sharing wonderful information about how to work with this population. So thank you everyone for attending, and we hope to hear from you soon. All right, take care.
Thanks, everyone.